We had set before us moments ago in that passage from John 13 two symbols of the Christian faith, the towel and basin that Jesus used to wash his disciples' feet. You're familiar with the Christian symbol of the cross upon which our Savior died. You're familiar with the symbol of the empty tomb, the tomb through which Jesus provided us victory over sin and death. You are familiar with the Christian symbol of the bread and the cup, through which Jesus said, every time you do this in remembrance of me. Yet we also have the Christian symbols of the towel and the basin. When you read through the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke give us the bread and the cup in the upper room. They give us the symbols of Jesus' death. But in John's Gospel, we don't get the bread and the cup of the Lord's Supper. We get the towel and the basin of service. And the towel and the basin put servanthood at the forefront. The towel and the basin link following Jesus in service. I would take it a step further, that the towel and the basin takes following Jesus and links following Jesus to service as an inseparable pair. And as we read moments ago, Jesus did this with great purpose. Jesus took on the role of a servant. Foot washing was considered the most lowly of tasks in the first century. Yet it was necessary. You know these stories well. The ancient roads were dusty and well-traveled. When a group gathered together, foot washing was a necessity because their feet and their sandals would be caked with the dust from the road they walked upon to get there. Foot washing was a necessary task, but it was also a menial task. It was the work of a servant. But it was so menial that a Jewish servant wouldn't perform the task. They would leave that lowly and menial task to a foreigner. Yet, there wasn't a foreign servant present that evening. There wasn't a servant present in the upper room that night during the events described to us in John 13. But Jesus was there. Jesus, the Son of God, Jesus, the Savior of the world, puts down that authority, puts down those titles, and takes on the role of a servant. Can you imagine that scene for just a moment? When Jesus, the Son of God, Jesus, the Savior of the world, stoops down to wash the feet of his disciples. I'm sure you can picture it because you've read the passage before. You've heard it discussed in church before. But to take it a step further, can you imagine the sense of uneasiness that welled up in the hearts of the disciples as Jesus took on the role of a servant. It's a bit hard for us to understand because we live in a time when there's a far too common crisis between what someone teaches and how they actually live. We're all too familiar with a medical doctor that smokes cigarettes. We're familiar with the financial planner that carries large amounts of debt. We're far too familiar with a famous preacher that gets caught in sinful relationships. In each case, these experts live in direct contradiction to their message. But here we see Jesus, one who spoke of love, one who spoke of humility, one who spoke of service. And we see him put those words on full display through actual, concrete, tangible love and humility and service. Jesus took on the role of a servant, but that's where there's a powerful message for us. We are blessed when we follow Jesus. Jesus told his disciples that night, you don't really understand what I'm doing here. Yeah, you know I'm washing your feet, but he tells them directly, you don't really comprehend everything that's taking place here. But we, as ones on this side of the cross and the empty tomb, we know the end of the story. Soon after this night in the upper room where Jesus washes the disciples' feet, Jesus will be betrayed, he will be crucified, he will be buried, and he will be resurrected. And of all the things he could have done, of all the things he could have said, right before the betrayal and the crucifixion and the resurrection, Jesus took up the towel and basin. And he washed feet. The foot washing had a significance beyond the literal act itself. Jesus was showing that humble service is the way we follow Jesus. He calls us to this life of service. And I know we've heard the passage before, but there's a beautiful line in there that Jesus concludes the foot washing experience by telling his disciples and by telling us, now that you know these things, you will be blessed if you do them. Notice that. He didn't say, now that you know these things, you will be blessed. After he had just washed their dirty feet, he would say, now that you know this is how you should live, now that you know that this is how you follow me, you will be blessed if you actually do this. I promised the guys in the media team that I was going to stick to the script, but now here's where I jump off. Because just a little more needs to be said there. We're constantly thinking about how we can get blessed. Jesus says, you want to be blessed? Pick up a towel and basin. You want to be blessed? Go out of your way and serve. You want to be blessed, do something that requires sacrifice in my name. Jesus is teaching us this valuable lesson that knowledge of what is right has no value if it doesn't change our behavior. Did you catch that? Knowledge of what is right has no value unless it changes our behavior. Jesus says if you want to be blessed, live a life of service. I would tell you this evening, if you want to preach the gospel, declare that Jesus is Lord. Yes, it takes words. If you want to preach the gospel, declare that Jesus is Lord and serve. Now that you know these things, you will be blessed as you do them. Jesus called us to a life of service, and as a church, we've selected a few men to lead us in service. And we call this group of men deacons. I don't want to bore you with this, but I'll bore you with it for a minute. Deacon is actually a transliterated word. Notice that I said transliterated, not translated. When you translate a word, you take the Greek word and then you replace it with the appropriate English word. When you transliterate, you take the word and you don't replace it with an English word. You just take the Greek word and you make it sound like English. If you were to actually translate the word we find in our Bible that we call deacon, if you actually translated it, it would be servant. We haven't translated the Greek word diakonos. We've just made it sound like English, and we use it as a title. But to be a deacon is to be a servant. It means we as a church, we're all called. The words of John 13 are words to all of us. We are called to follow Jesus through service. But as a church, we've selected men to lead us in that service. As deacons, they carry the towel and the basin. And a service like this evening is to remind us of that and to hold us all accountable to that. Wade was up here a moment ago, and he prayed for all of us that we would live lives of service. We now have a time in the service where we will pray for our deacons, where we will pray for our servants to lead us in service. Eddie, please come.